15 or 48. Lechu niranin al Adonai, Nari al Zoishenu, Nekadim afanav betoda, Bizmiron Nari alo, Kiel Gadol Adonai Melech al Golenu. Arba'im shana god bedor va Omar Amdoye Lebavhem Vehem Lo Yadu Derachai Asher Nishbati Be'avi Im Yavo El Menuchati Shiru Ladonai Shir Bada Shiru Ladonai Kol Haaretz Shiru Ladonai Baruch Shemo Vasru Meyom Leyom Yeshuato Zabru Bagoyim Again Vodo Bechol Ha'amim V'yoda Hagig Adol Adonai Hol Aleot Hanorahu Hal Kol Elohi Hay 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 Kol Elohi Ha'amim Elilim Ba'adonai Shamayim Asa Hode Hadar Lefanav Hozeti Feret B'migdasho Avul Adonai Mishpechot Amim Avul Adonai Gavod Ba'od Avul Adonai Gevod Shema Haosehu Mincho Ubahol Chazrotav Ay 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 Shachavul Adonai Veharat Kodesh Chilu Mipada Gol Haaretz Imru Bagoyim Adonai Malach Hafti Kontebel Abalat Imot Yadin Amim B'Mesharim Yismechu Hashama B'Tagel Haaretz O Yiramaya Yalo Sadai V'chol asher bo Hay 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 Haziranu Kol Hatzeyar Lifnei Adonai Ki Hiva Lishbot Haaretz Yishbot Tevel B'Zedek Ve'amim B'emunata Ay 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 Page 17 or 51. Yismechu Hayim Rabbeinu. Shama Vatisma Zion Vatayena Benor Yehuda Leman Mishpatecha Adonai Ki Ata Adonai Elyon Al Gol Haaretz Me'or Na'aleita Al Kol Elohim Ohavei Adonai Zinurav Shomer Nafshot Chasidav להצילם אור זרו על הצדיק ולשרי שמחה שמחו צדיקים באדוני והודו לזכר קודשו page 18 of 52 מזמור שירו לאדוני שיר חדש כי נפלאות עשה הושיע לו ימינו עוזרו קודשו הודיע אדוני ישועתו לעיני הגויים גילה צדקתו זכר חסדו ואמונתו לבית ישראל קראו כל עשי הארץ את ישועות אלוהינו הריעו לאדוני כל הארץ ניצחו ורננו וזמרו זמרו לאדוני בכינור בכל זמרה בחצות רעות בקול שופר הריעו לפני המלך אדוני ירם הים ומלואו תבל ויושבה נהרות ימחו כף יחד הרים ירננו לפני אדוני גיבה לשבות ישבות תבל בצדק נעמים בבני שערים Page 19 or 53 Adonai Malach Yirgezu Amim Yoshev Kruvim Ramamu Adonai Leinu Vishtachavu Lehar Kodsho Ki Kadosh Adonai Eloheinu Mizmor LeDavid Havul Adonai B'nei Heli Havul Adonai O Kavod Ma'od Hay 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 Havul Adonai Kevod Shemo Yishtachavu Adonai B'Hadrat Kodesh Kol Adonai Ha'alamayim El HaKavod Irim Adonai Ha'alamayim Rabim Kol Adonai Ba'koach Hay 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 Kol Adonai Behadar Kol Adonai Shober Arazim Vayishaber Adonai Et Arzei Halbanon Vayakidehem Yemo Egel Levanon Vesirion Kemo Veremim Ay 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 Kol Adonai Chotev Lavotesh Kol Adonai Yachil Midbar Yachil Adonai Midbar Kadesh Kol Adonai Cholel Ayalon Vayechesov Yeharosh Uveichalo Kulo Omer Kavod Ay 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 Adonai Lahamabul Yashav Yeshem Adonai Melech Leolam 54. Anna bekoach gedulat yemincha tatir zerura kabel rinatamecha sagavenu taharenu nora Hohanna bekoach gedulat yemincha tatir zerura kabel rinatamecha sagavenu taharenu nora Lechadoni ligrat gala Bnei Shabbat nekabela Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad Hishmianu elam yuchad Adonai echad u'shmo echad L'shem u'tiferet v'ledila Lechadoni ligrat gala Bnei Shabbat nekabela Lechadoni ligrat gala Bnei Shabbat nekabela Likrat Shabbat lechu v'nelcha Ki mekor haberacha Merosh mikedem nesucha Sof ma'aseh b'machshava tchila Lechadoni ligrat kala Bnei Shabbat nekabela Lechadoni ligrat kala Bnei Shabbat nekabela Migdash melech ir melucha Kumitzi mitoch ha'afecha Rav lach shevet b'yemek hamacha Vehu yachamol alayich emla Lechadoni ligrat gala Bnei Shabbat nekabela Lechadoni ligrat gala Bnei Shabbat nekabela Hitnari me'afar kumi Livshi bigdei tifartechami Al yad ben ishai be'ed halachmi Korva el nafshi gehala Lechadoni ligrat gala Bnei Shabbat nekabela Lechadoni ligrat gala Bnei Shabbat nekabela Hidoreri v'horegu mi ori Shir da beheri givod adon la yechenig la lecha nodi le grata la b'nei shavane kabela lo tevoshi velo tikalmi ma tishtochachi umatehemi vach yechesu anye ahami minni kahiranti la Salayi Elohai Kimso Hatana Kalahal Nili Kratala Ben Neshama Kabela Ay Aminus Multi Froti Dadonai Ben party v'nis mecha v'nagila lecha dodi krat kala b'nei shama nekabela Page 23 or 59, Mizmor Shir. Leyom HaShabbat, Tzadik Atam Ahar Yifrach Keherez Balvanon Yizgeshetulim Bevet Adonai Bechatzrot Eloheinu Yafrichu Od Yenuvun B'Seva Deshenim Berananim Yehu Lehagid Yashar Adonai Suri Velo Amlatabo Adonai Malach Geud Lavesh Adonai Ositazav Tikon Teman Mikolot Mahayim Ma'im Rabbi Adirim Mishbereyam Mikolot Mahayim Ma'im Rabbi Adirim Mishbereyam Hadir Bamarom Hay 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 Hadir Bamarom Hay 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 Hadir Bamarom Adonai Hadir Bamarom Hay 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 Hadir Bamarom Hay 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 Hadir Bamarom Adonai Hedotecha Nemnumel Leveichana V'Kodesh Adonai Leorech Yamim. This week we observe the Yartzeiten of Ruth Jaffe, mother of Marshall Jaffe, Theodore Handelman, father of Stephen Handelman, Morris Steinberg, grandfather of Florence Grossman, Stanley Backer, father of John Backer, William Koblenz, uncle of Eleanor Dreyfus, Esther Taub, mother of Shelley Klein, Felix Bronner, father of Ethan Bronner, Ardis Reed, mother of Lydia Reed, Samuel Rubach, father of Daniel Rubach, Ann Yelsey, mother of Neil Yelsey, Marcia Lanoyle, mother of Jerry Lanoyle, and also Nathan Vindman, Golda Cohen, Anna Rosenberg, and Manya Fraulo, who are memorialized on our board. May their memories and the memories of all those whom we recall be blessings. Mourner's Kaddish is on page 62 or 24. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei Rabbah be'alma divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael ba'gala u'v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam u'lalmei almaya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yipa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnasei Vitadar, Vitale, Vitalal, Shmeid Kudsha, Brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tush bechata v'nechemata, damiran be'alma v'imru, amen. Yehei shalama rabba min shemaya, v'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru, amen. O say shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom, Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Good Shabbos. It's so nice to see everyone. Thank you for our beautiful davening on Shabbat Shirah, which is Shabbat of Song, when we read Song of the Seas. I want to just say it's such a blessing, okay, to be davening in a room and, there's only a few people. And with each person that comes in, you're like, oh, I'm glad it's that person. It's such a blessing to be in a room like that, where each person who comes through the door, you're like, oh, what a relief that person's here. I'm not going to name all your names, because I would name all your names. And it's just, I really felt that way. It was really wonderful. So I just want to share two beautiful midrashim about song, because it is Shabbat Shirah. And tomorrow we read Shirat Hayam, which is Song of the Sea, which the people sing when leaving Egypt. It's one of the many songs preserved in the Torah, and there's two midrashim. The first one is this. It's that when the people were liberated, the angels wanted to sing too. And God says, no, the people have to sing first. And he pulls the angels aside and he says, it's not because I want to diminish you and because I don't want to hear your song, but it's because the people are mortal. And I want to hear what they have to say before they die. And you guys are going to sing forever, and I can listen to you forever, but these people right here, they don't have all of the time in the world. And I think the simple and beautiful message of this midrash is we got to sing while we can. We got to sing while we can. And the second midrash I want to share, which is related in my mind because it's also beautiful, and I'll try to make it related in my mind by the end of this little drasha, is that the second song that's preserved in the Parsha this week is not Shirat Hayam, Moshe's song, but Miriam's song, which happens afterwards, and it's much shorter. And it says, Miriam gathered her hand drums. It's often mistranslated as timbrels, but they didn't have tambourines back then. It was probably a hand drum that she took, but it's some kind of musical instrument. And she took her hand drums with all of the women, and they started to sing this song. The rabbis asked, where did they get those drums? Where did they get those drums? Because they're fleeing, and you would think that they're only going to take the things that they really, really, really need. Comes the Mechilta and says, well, yes, but the righteous women who were fleeing Egypt, they had a feeling that they were going to get this great miracle, and they had a feeling that they would need those drums. They had a feeling that they would need those drums. And okay, I love both of these midrashim, and I think really the simple message kind of that's behind both of them is like, you got to sing what you can sing while you have the breath to sing it. And you better take those drums. Like whatever you're going through and wherever you're headed, you better take those instruments, because you got to believe that one day you are going to need them. And maybe much sooner than you think. We'll continue with Ma'ariv in just a moment on page 28 or 64. Does someone want to take over from Ma'ariv? Please rise.
Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach.
Baruch Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Le'olam Umavir Yom Umevi Laila Umavdil Ben Yom Uve Laila Adonai Tzevaot Shemo Echad V'Kayam Tamid Yimloch Aleinu Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Ata Adonai HaMa'ariv Aravi Avat Olam Beit Yisrael Amcha V'Torah Hakim Otanu Limadeta Hakein Adonai Eloheinu V'shofenu uvkumeinu Nasiach bechukecha V'nishmach b'divrei Toratecha Uv'mitzvotecha Le'olam va'ed Ki hem chayenu v'orech yameinu v'orech yameinu Uvahem negel yomam v'layla yomam v'layla Baruch atah sim mimenu le'olamim Baruch atah Adonai ohev amo Yisrael Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad V'yavta et Adonai Elohecha B'chol levavecha U'b'chol nafshecha U'b'chol me'odecha V'hayu hadvarim ha'eleh Asher Anochi Mitzavecha Hayom Alevavecha V'shinatam Levanecha V'divarta Bam B'shiftecha V'veitecha U'lechtecha V'aderech U'shoftecha V'kumecha U'kshartam Liot Ayadecha V'hayu Letotafot B'neinecha Uktavta Amizuzo Petecha Uvisharecha Hashem Something ever זמן ימו ויאמר לנו שלמו ציצי Adonai Elohim Emet 32 or 70 ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם משה ובני ישראל לחנו שירה בשמחה רבה ואמרו כולם מי כמוך באלים אדוני מי כמוך נדע בקודש נורתי לא תוסף מלכותך ראו בניך בוקעם לפני משה זה אלינו ואמרו אדוני עמו לעולם ונאמר כי פדה אדוני יעקב וגואלו מיד חזק ממנו ברוך אתה אדוני גא ישראל אשכיבנו ותקם את חסר שטן מלפנינו שמור צאתנו ובואנו לחיים ולשלום מעתה ועד עולם ופרוס עלינו סוכת שלומך ברוך אתה אדוני הבורא סוכת שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל ועל ירושלים ושם יראו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורתם ברית עולם היי ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם Shabbat Vayina. Vayigara Shemei Rabba. V'yama Divra Kurudei V'yamlik Makotei V'chayechonu V'yamechonu V'chayetu Kol Beit Yisrael. V'agalav V'zman Kari V'yimeru. Amen. Hey Shemei Rabba Mevora. V'yolam Me'amaya. V'yitna Sevi. David Levi Shemei Kudisha. Leila Mekober Chata V'shirata Tushbechata V'nechamata Damiram B'yama V'yimeru. Amen. Yamidah can be found on 35B or A or 76. Shalom, shalom bin Roma, uyaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol Yisrael, v'yimeru, amen. Page 47 or 89. Vayechulu hashamayim ve'haaretz v'chol tzeva vayachal Elohim bayom hashvi'i milachto asher asa vayishbot bayom hashvi'i mikol milachto asher asa vayevarech Elohim et yom hashvi'i v'yakadesh oto ki bo shabbat mikol melachto asher barach Elohim laso Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avoteinu Elohei Abraham Elohei Yitzchak v'Elohei Yaakov Elohei Sarah Elohei Rivka Elohei Rachel Elohei Leah El Hagadol Hagibor v'Hanora El Elyon Konei Shamayim v'Aretz Magen Avot Bivaro Mechayim Meitim B'Mamaro Ha'el HaKadosh Shein Kamohu Ha'eniach Le'amo B'Yom Shabbat Kosho Ki Vam Ratza Le'Haniach Lahem Ki Vam Ratza Le'Haniach Lahem Lefanav Navod V'Irav V'Fachad V'Nodeh Lishmo B'Chol Yom Tamid Me'on HaBerachot El HaHodahot Hadon HaShalom Mekadesh HaShabbat U'Verei Shvi'i U'Meniach B'Kedusha Le'amedu Shnei Omer Zecher L'Maaseh Bereshit Eloheinu v'Elohei Avoteinu Ritzeh V'Menuchateinu K'Hadshenu b'mitzvotecha V'ten chelkeinu b'toratecha Sahabeinu nituvecha ושמחנו בשובתך, ותאר ליבנו לעבדך באמת, והנחילנו אדוני אלוהינו באהבה וברצון שבת קודשך וינוחו בעל ישראל מקדשי שמך. ברוך אתה ה' מקדש השבת יגדל וגדל שמרה בה בעמד ירח ירדף ומשפחותיך חייכון ומכון ובכעת לכל בית ישראל בגלה בזמן קריב ויאמרו אמן. יהי שמרה בו מבורך לעולם ימי המיה יתברך. יתברך ישתבח ויתברך ירמם יתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלה שמי לקודשא מן כל ברכתה ושרתה ושפחתה ונחמתה דמירם בימה ויאמרו ובעזור לקום דכל ישראל קודמו והום ויביא שמי ויאמרו וישם רב משמי וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו עושה שלום במרומיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו
Yiddish is on page 49. He's going to lead us.
How nice.
You got to grab the cup.
Yep.
L'chaim.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam orei v'hi hagafel. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu mitzvotav v'ratzavanu v'shabbat kodsho b'yama u'ratzon hinchilanu zikaron l'maaseh b'reishit Kibu yom tefillah le'mivrei kodesh zecher l'tziat Mitzrayim Imanu b'charta v'yotanu kidasha mikorim v'shabbat kodshecha v'yahava u'ratzon hinchilanu Baruch atah Adonai mekadesh hashabat.
Drink your
That's right. You get to drink the wine. Do you want any more?
later.
Okay, thank you. That's enough room, okay.
Page 51.
The mourner's cottage can be found on 52 or 101. Yitgadal, Yitgadash, Shemei Rabbi, Yama, Diva, Pirutei. Shmei Rabba Vorach Leolam Amen. Yitbarach Yishabach Yitbar Yiromam Zase Yitadar Yitare Zal Shmei Revu Leila Mikol Birchata Shirata Tushachata Vechmata Amiram Yallah Amen. Shmei Rabba Mishmai Chaim Aleinu Yaakov Yisrael Amen.
Amen. Before we do, I just want to say thank you to everyone who helped make this possible. I'm going to forget some people, so Mario, clue me in on the list.
Thank you to our co-sponsors, the Ames House family, the Samuels family, in honor of Oscar Brimmer, the father. No, my father. Your father, technically. Melanie's father, not my father. The Tevis family, thank you so much. The Glick family for cooking, the Sarabransky family for cooking, the Herzog family for cooking, and Abe's House family for helping to set up, and I think that.
And to Mario.
Thank you
And
those
to
for
Mario
helping.
and to Mario for helping.
Thank you for cleaning up your own dishes, because there's no mama here to clean up your dishes.
Everyone for cleaning up.
Thank you. It takes a bit. Thank you so much, Mario, to everyone for having it possible. So just the plan for the evening, we'll go eat in just a minute, and then at about 8 or so, we're gonna hear from Steve about life in Russia, and it should be fascinating. And so please stay around for that. And Steve, do you want to say anything about what you're gonna say, or to whet people's appetite? Keep it a secret. Okay. Great. So marvelous. So stick around for that. And then just one correction. We've been saying that the next Hartman section is on February 15th. It's not. It's on Valentine's Day, February 14th. So I'm not going to say cancel your romantic evenings, but if you're the kind of people, you're like, yeah, we've been together a while, we're not doing it, come out to Hartman, come out for Hartman, because there's nothing says romantic like high-level Jewish learning.
Exactly. That's the spin.
So please do come out if you're not doing anything. It is on February 14th at Temple Israel Center. Yeah. And there's a few more announcements.
Yeah, very brief. Kiddush this week for tomorrow is being sponsored by Daniel Rubach in honor of the yard site of his father Samuel. And tomorrow will be the continuation of Shabbat Shira, where we will hope to pack the house and starting at 9:30 have as joyous singing as we've had tonight, which has really been quite beautiful. Most of the rest you've heard before. The one other thing I did want to mention that's important for everybody to be aware of is on Friday, February 10th, I guess that's next week, there is a refugee Shabbat for this year. It will be at 6 p.m. We are collaborating with Hayas and the Westchester Jewish Coalition for Immigration. We're going to hear from Alexander Sabiolo during our Friday night service, who is, I believe, a refugee from the Ukraine. And dinner will follow at the rabbi's home, but space is limited. So please RSVP to the office so that the rabbi could know who's going to be coming, and also do it early because there's only so much room. So
I was going to say one more thing about this. What's that? And Shabbat morning after that is Shabbat Mishpacha. And also just about the refugee effort, as some of you know, we've had some volunteers who have been working with Hearts and Homes and some other local institutions to support your refugee families in Afghanistan. God willing, that the work is going to sort of wrap up as we get into the spring, because hopefully the families will be self-sufficient, which is of course the point. And then we're going to try to stay involved in the work. And I want to say we're going to really try, our goal right now, and there's a few other, none of them are here right now, but there are a few leaders who have been working on this a lot, are going to really try to take ownership of the project this time around. So if you want to be involved, we need like a few more quarterbacks to really make it happen. So if you want to be really involved, hopefully in our next effort to help resettle a family, please talk to me, or to Mike Dvorkin, or to Melanie Stern, or to Matt Marcus, or to Mimi Steinberg, or to Rhonda Singer. And we need like those. So if you want to be involved with that, that's going to be a new thing that's coming up very soon. So.
And we need you.
And we need you.
I want to. It's It's me.
Me too. Yes. So
And-
please consider that. Okay.
And one of the Gimel Chesed front, the soup kitchen. The next delivery date is February 16th. If you can contact your library, and the menu is lasagna, 2 large bags of carrots, and cookies. So okay, so we'll conclude services on page 53 or 114 with Yigdal. Yigdal Elokim Chai v'yishtaba Yitzav v'nei El Shivto Echad v'yachid ki yichudo Nelam v'gam en sof ve'achduto Ein lo glut haguf ve'ein lo guf Lo na'aruch elav kedushato Kadon l'chol davar asher nivra Rishon ben Rishit l'Rishito Hino Adon Olam V'chol Otzar Yorei Gulato Malchuto Shefat Gulato Netano Elan Sheitz Gulato V'tifarto Lo Kam Yisrael K'Moshe Navi Ma'avid Et Emunato Torah Natan Le'amoel Hayad Le'io Neman Le'to Lo Yachal Yifa'el Ve'lo Yamir Dato Le'olamim Le'zulato Tofer Yodea Setahareinu Mabit B'sof Davar V'kalmato Go Belish Chesed K'mifalo Noten Rashara Gerishato Yishlach L'Ketz Yamim Meshirichenu Lifto Mekakeketz Yeshuato Meitim Yechayel Berochasto Baruch Adei Hashem Kilato Meitim Yechayel Berochasto Baruch Adei Hashem
Shakoa. It's nice to have it. Yeah, it did. It is nice to have it.
I had to go up to Broadway, into one of Authorized by law. So then, finally, they send me a fucking text, with the... It's such a scam. These guys make so much money from this. I told you when I went into that very club, I was in for 2 days. I was on the sailing trip. I wasn't on any gas. I got one procedure. When they didn't even give me it's a work week. 2 days, 48,000. Yep. No, definitely do. I'm like, how can they even literally come up with that? I didn't have any, I did not. Oh, yeah, I've been responsible. I think they ended up paying like 18, but even that was crazy. see, so we go from Thursday through Sunday, Saturday nights are the first game. So let's see, so we'll go to the practice, we'll let out. So you can see
It's a place called Duffy's. It's a restaurant. A lot of players love it.
Alright.
It's a sports bar restaurant. You can eat some Duffy's. It's right. Walking distance.
We can meet there. Well, like, we see any, don't tell them that they're gonna go to the minor leagues or they better get right in. Just sit
You
on.
don't critique them.
Yeah.
So you know, you really have to watch that because that curveball. Oh, that'd be fun. I went some years back with we had a blast. We stayed on the West Coast for the most part. We crossed over and something like that.
At 7, well,
You a Mets fan? You want to see something really cool? So when you get older, you can go to Mets Fantasy. So you get to go down to spring training. It's not spring training, it's before spring training. You go, you get your own uniform, you go with other adults your age, and all the former players are there. You get to hang out with them, and they coach you, and you play actual games on the field. I haven't showed you the cool thing. I went 10 years ago. Yeah, I think it was just the anniversary of that. And you get to play, and they take video of you, and a baseball card. And if you're really lucky, they take a video of you doing something really good. I was very fortunate because I had a video camera. I actually did something very good. Everyone who's ever met me has seen it. No. That's me. Pretty cool, huh? Me again. That catch was the thing. It took me about practicing my whole life to do that catch.
Sunday, so it's Sunday for the party.
Nice.
Alright, buddy, thank you very much. Let's go.
Find that part.
Say short term, John.
much, right? It's better than this.
Will there be vodka?
So we're closing the sides, so everybody sits in the front. There can be. No, you don't want to stick people.
You want to get them all grouped in front? So-
So I'm going to bring the crowd in.
Good idea.
Before you go, you may sit, I would love for you to sit next to me. But now you're going
Actually, well, nobody wants to see the first round. Steve, are you going to ask questions? Can we see the first round?
So I realized that we're getting people in. Everybody who's we'll get started.
So we're gonna-
Anyway, thank you all for coming to our first Challah and Conversation evening. I think it's our first. It is. I'll call it my first Challah and Conversation evening. We're sort of a test of whether this would work, and I feel like it did. I feel like this was really nice. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Now, his bio, unfortunately, is on my cell phone, so I won't be reading it. But Steve, to summarize, Steve has been in the, going back a few years.
Few years.
To when Steve was a correspondent in Moscow, right, in Russia. Were you in St. Petersburg as well? Were you
I was all over. I was all over the
Okay.
what was then the Soviet Union.
So I know that everybody here in this room has a story. And today Adam and I hung out and cooked together, and I learned some of his story. This is some of Steve's story, because often we all know each other from here in shul. We dive in together, we chit-chat a little bit after, and then we go home, and I'm like, so the rabbi and I organized these mix and mingles the first summer that I was here, so he could get to know people. And he went to this one mingle that Steve was at and some other people. I wasn't at that one. And he came in and he was like, Steve wrote this book about the CIA. And I'm like, are you freaking kidding me?
Mafia.
And the mafia. Like, I'm like, I've known him for years. And my
Same
daughter is classmates with, or they had a conversation about, I don't know what. But I'm like, So thank you for coming, and we'll learn a little bit. And if you've also been in Russia, if you're from Russia, it's not just a one-way type of thing. We'll talk, we'll be together, and it's Shabbat, so you have nowhere else to be.
Thank you, Marjorie. I like the conversation part, so I'm going to try to. I was given 20 minutes, more or less, and I'm going to try to stick to that, and then open it up for questions. I know you have lots of questions, but really, thank you all for staying. This is Moscow weather.
Warm for Moscow.
In fact, it's warm for Moscow. But I thought I would begin. I was trying to figure out. It's very difficult to talk dispassionately about Russia right now, at a time when there's this barbaric attack going on in Ukraine. But as I'll try to show you, Russia is a lot more than just a war in Ukraine. It's also a lot different, a lot less. It's an entire civilization and culture, which I came to understand and appreciate in the time that I was there. When I was trying to figure out how to begin, because I could speak for hours about my time in the Soviet Union, I thought, especially since this is a moving weekend for me, I'm observing the yahrzeit of my dad, I thought I would begin with my dad, actually, and take you back almost 120 years to a place called Kishinev. And those of you who don't know, Kishinev was the site of the first pogrom, major pogrom of the 20th century. In 1903, Kishinev was a little town in Moldova, what's now Moldova, and the numbers who were killed were paltry compared to what happened in the Holocaust. But at the time when it happened, it was a world-shaking event. Tens of thousands of Jews died. The Cossacks were mostly responsible. It was a hate Jew kind of scene, and it was a terrible, terrible event. At the time, my great-grandfather was in charge of a cheder in Kishinev. In one of the main streets in Kishinev, there were numbers of yeshivas and schools in the Jewish section of Kishinev, and he was the head of one of them. And he had a family of 12 kids. My father was the youngest kid. And he would tell me stories about, I don't think they were totally true, but when he was a boy, he remembering a little bit about what happened during the pogrom. The Cossacks would come in to the area where the Jews were, to the houses, and they would hide the kids in sacks of flour. The Cossacks knew that, and they would take their swords and put their swords right through the sacks of flour. My father loved talking about this. Frankly, I think he didn't remember it at all. But at the age of, maybe he was 1 or 2, the family decided to take off. They left. And they emigrated from Kishinev to New York, the whole family, and that's how I came to grow up in America. And my father never really spoke much more than that about life in Kishinev, he spoke Russian. His mother, my grandmother, spoke Russian as well as Yiddish, and I knew very little about the family beyond that. So, in cut another 50 or 60 or 70 years, I was a correspondent in London. I was the head of a London bureau. And at the time, we were hearing about this stuff that was going on in Russia called perestroika. Russia was opening up for the first time. You could actually write and speak to people without worrying about somebody censoring what you wrote. And my editor said, well, why don't you see if you could open up a bureau in Russia, because a lot of other people were doing it. And I said, great, I'd love to do it. I had I'd done some covering as a reporter in the mid-'80s or so, around that time, covering some stuff that was going on in Russia, some news stuff, but I didn't know very much about it. And I jumped at the opportunity. I said, yes, definitely, I want to do it. And I was with a bunch of, at that point, there was a whole cohort of us, young journalists, ambitious. Many of us didn't speak Russian, some did. And we saw this was the story of the future. We didn't know how much of a story it was going to be by the time we got there. And my wife, Sue, as you know, both of us got in a car in Finland. We bought a car in Helsinki. We were told we had to do it because you couldn't get a car in Russia. We set up a trip and got all our papers together and drove from Helsinki down to Moscow, which was supposed to be a 2 or 3 day trip. We said, this is going to be great. We will get to know the country, and it will be a great introduction to what the Soviet Union is and how we were going to live there for the next 3, 4, 5 years. And the first thing we discovered that as soon as you cross the border, everybody knows who you are. Everybody. Every 10 miles, there was a police post. At that point, they were called the GAI. And the police would see that you were obviously a foreign car, you had a foreign license plate. They would take down your license and call ahead to the next post, 10 or 15 miles down the road. And they would time you. And we didn't realize this until at one point about halfway between Petersburg and Moscow, we saw a sign to a village that looked interesting. I can't remember why. I said, well, let's take a look at that. So we did a detour, went down a road and just looked at the village, spent about a half hour going through it, came out, came back on the highway. The next police post, stop. So we got out of the car, what's going on? What did we do wrong? He said, what took you so long? So what do you mean? They had timed us. And they knew that we were supposed to have been at their GAI post an hour or so from the time we passed the last GAI post. And we'd been an hour and a half. They were immediately suspicious. They thought, oh, you're obviously spies. We said, we couldn't speak Russian very well then. We said, well, no, we were just going to look at a village. What village? Why did you do that? Who did you speak to? They put us on a grill for the next half hour, an hour. And we said, well, they're going to hold us back. By the time we get to the next GAI post, we're going to be even later, and they're going to call us again. But they called ahead to the GAI post. That was our first introduction to Mother Russia and to living there in what was life in a police state. We were set up, we had an apartment in an area of Moscow which is right near the main market. Those of you who know Moscow will know the Cheremishkinsky market. It was what we would think might be a middle class such as it is in Moscow. At that point, Moscow had no street names. you couldn't figure out where you were going because there were no maps. Maps were, if you had a map, the only maps that were available were CIA maps, and you couldn't be seen with them. The idea then was that if people had maps, they could invade Moscow. So maps were not allowed. So we basically, walking around Moscow, driving around Moscow, we had to realize and guess where we were all the time. But where we were, we lived in a sort of a high-rise building where we were assigned to, and foreign correspondents and foreigners were all assigned to special buildings where they could keep an eye on us. We couldn't just go out and buy an apartment or rent an apartment, or we could stay in a hotel, but that wouldn't be acceptable. And we realized that we had special license plates that identified us from each country that we came from. So I was writing for a Canadian publication, and my license plate began with, I think it was 03, because that was the license for Canada. So anywhere I went in Moscow, people knew that I was from Canada. I think 01 was the UK. Why, I'm not sure. I think maybe it was the order of how they recognized the old Soviet Union, be that as it may. So we got we were given apartments, and we were going to work out of the apartments, and we were given people who were going to work for us. And of course, we knew that the people who were going to work for us were all going to be reporting on us. And they were. They weren't KGB, but they worked for the KGB. In order to be able to work for us, and they spoke English, they had to be able to report back to the KGB what we were doing. This was the first initial years that we were there. And the building was about a 10 or 12-story building. There were many of those buildings around Moscow where foreigners lived or where diplomats lived. So we were with a bunch of diplomats, mostly from the US, but there were some from Hungary, there were people from France, and there were a lot of journalists and obviously correspondents. And it was a strange life because every time we left, there was another GAI post there, and they would take our license plate, and they would know where we were going because they would be able to follow us if they wanted to. And when we came back, they also knew what time we came back, if we were going out in a story or whatever else. And I did a lot of coverage at that time of the refuseniks. I don't know if you remember who the refuseniks were. These were people, they were Jews who were trying to get out of the country at that point, and they couldn't. They were dissidents. And most of them were trying to speak to journalists and publicize their plight and everything else. And we would go out, usually late at night, to talk to them. And there are other buildings and high-rises around Moscow. And each time we went out, there were always people following us. And they would know where we were going, and we tried to escape them. But it wasn't possible. At least we thought it wasn't possible. They always knew where we were. And we knew they were listening to us on the phone. And after a while, you kind of got used to this. Believe it or not. I mean, you talk to somebody and you hear a click and you know, well, somebody's listening.
What year is it we're talking about?
We're talking about 1988, 1989. And, people were, you couldn't have an argument with your wife because they'd hear what you were saying. If you wanted to have an argument with your wife, you'd have to go outside. And literally that's what you do. You'd go downstairs, you take the little elevator down, you'd walk past the GAI post, and by the time you got there, you weren't going to argue anymore because it took so long. But, so we were continuing, and there were kids throughout the building and all that, but in about 1988, things started to loosen up considerably. You all know about perestroika. Gorbachev was in power. He's beginning to talk about changing the system, reforming the system. Things were getting a lot better, particularly for correspondence. It's the reason why we went there, because we were going to be able to travel around the country to speak to whoever we wanted to speak to, within reason. And in fact, we were. I mean, there wasn't a place in the Soviet Union at that time that I didn't travel to. We were at the North Pole. We were in the Caucasus. We were in the Pacific with Vladivostok. We were in the Baltics. We were in Central Asia. There probably were very few places, and I mean, I was incredibly lucky where I didn't go. I mean, there were obviously closed areas where I couldn't go. And if you went there, they were the GAI posts. Right? They would know who you were. But things were really loosening up. So at a certain point, we were wondering, how serious are they? Because all of us had a minder who we knew was a KGB person. either an official KGB or someone who spoke to the KGB. I had a monitor who I really liked, who ended up defecting to Canada. He was a really, really nice guy. We were great friends. And, you know, I used to say, well, don't tell him anything. He's going to tell everybody else, you know, what you're doing and I said, it doesn't matter. I mean, he doesn't care. And the truth was, by the time, we're talking about 1988, 89, they really didn't care. At that point, things were so loose. Gorbachev had changed the culture and the atmosphere of the country that it was a police state in all but name, or in name only, but not in reality. And the proof of this was a story that I heard about our building. I can't verify it, but as I said, there was a bunch of kids who lived in our building, in our apartment house, and they reported, we knew that the top floor of the building was where the KGB hung out. That's where they did their listening. And in fact, we knew that we saw strange people coming down from the top floor, because you never get up to the top floor. I can't remember what floor it was. Let's say it was the 11th floor. You couldn't live beyond the 10th floor. But kids could go all over the building. So a bunch of kids, the children of one of the diplomats, told us this story that they had gone up to the 11th floor. They'd opened the elevator, and they saw these guys sitting around in front of basically dashboards full of listening devices, where they were going to listen, they were going to put stuff in there. So it was true that they were up there to listen to what we said. But no one was listening. They were playing cards, they were drinking beer, they looked around, saw the kids, they laughed at them. They didn't invite them to come in, and the kids ran away. As soon as we heard this story, we said, life has definitely changed in Russia. And that was true in everything we did, because, you know, as I say, it's hard to talk about Russia dispassionately now because of the war and because of all the war crimes that are going on in Ukraine. But at the time, there were some beautiful, beautiful experiences and people there, and people began to experience freedom and the ability to speak and talk and to enjoy the culture and have the Russian culture come out. And, you know, as someone who had a Russian heritage, or Kishinev, Moldovan heritage, it was very, very meaningful to me. And about halfway through my tour there, I actually went to Kishinev. Because at that point, there was an organization that was set up to help Jews, American Jews, find their relatives. Or trace their relatives, excuse me. So I thought I'll do a story about this. And at the same time I'll do a story, I'll take advantage of it and see if I can find anybody in Kishinev. So Sue and I got in a plane. At that point, you had to go on special planes. If you were a foreigner, you couldn't go in ordinary, you couldn't just book an ordinary flight. You had to go in planes, even then, that were reserved for foreigners. That was because the actual flights, that, you know, the planes that they used were so bad that it was safer to go on, thank you, to go on these Russian flights. It's probably true. We flew down to Kishinev, and I was with someone who met us there, who's going to take me to the old areas of Kishinev, which was the Jewish ghetto. And I remember that my father had described the place where he grew up. Remember, he was 1 or 2 years old at most, if you remember. But he said it was like a compound, where it's a lot of families there. So I asked to be taken to the Jewish ghetto, what was then the Jewish ghetto. Very few Jews there, obviously, then. There were a few left, which I'll talk about in a second. And I got to the compound, and I started talking to people. At that time, I could speak Russian, more or less. And I started to ask people, did you know anybody named Gendelman? Because in Russian, there was no H, there was a G, so it was Gendelman, not Handelman. And I asked around, I looked at people, I said, you know, is there any Gendelmans around? And people looked at me strangely, and then suddenly someone said, you know, there's an old lady who lives in that house over there who's a Gendelman. I said, you're kidding. He said, no, you should go visit her. I said, I found a relative. So I went, I knocked on her door. I said, is your name Gendelman? She said, yes. I said, I think I'm a relation. My name is Gendelman too. I live in Moscow now, but I'm from the US. She started to cry. So, oh my gosh, where are you? She asked me my parents' name, my grandparents' name. Turns out she wasn't a relation. Not at all. But it was so moving. And she was one of the last of the Jews from that era to go there. And what was ironic about that was that at that time, we were starting to see problems in the old Soviet Union of nationalities. People were beginning to complain about anti-Semitism, about anti-Armenians, about there were wars in Georgia, and there was a new exodus in Moldova of Jews who were going to Israel. There were still Jews left in Kishinev, but they now felt they had to leave Kishinev now because it was no longer safe for any Jews to be there. And I thought, my God, what goes around comes around. Nothing had changed. But the only thing I could do in Kishinev was go to the cemetery where the victims of the 1903 pogrom were buried. It was an old, broken down cemetery. And I wrote an article about it. I didn't find a Gendelman at all in the place. So for me, being in Moscow was so personal, was not only a story as a journalist, it was an exciting story, one of the most amazing stories of the century. The breakup of the Soviet Union, the creation, I ended up living in 3 countries, basically, the Soviet Union, Russia, and kind of a hybrid country that was no longer Russia or the Soviet Union, but something very different. And it was incredibly meaningful for me. And after, I became very interested in the new perestroika, the entrepreneurial life of Russia. I discovered a big problem in Russia, which was the revival of the ancient criminal syndicates, and I wrote a book about the Russian mafia. Some of you may remember all the stories about the Russian mafia in the 90s. So I actually went out and talked to them and became a half expert in them and survived it. So I can talk about that later, and if you'd like to talk about that. But then, I left reluctantly. After my time was over, I left after about 5.5 years, and we came home to New York. And then, I went and did other things. And then now, fast forward to 2004, 100 years after my father had left Kishinev with his family. And a horrible event had happened in a place called Beslan, which is a little village in North Ossetia in the Caucasus. The Chechen terrorists or Chechen separatists had taken a school soldiers hostage. I don't know if any of you remember that. It was probably the worst school hostage taking ever in history. Over 1,800 people were taken hostage, including 700 kids. After the 2-day siege, 300 people were dead, including about 150 kids. It's an awful event. I wasn't there for that, but about 2 weeks later, I came back to Russia. I was invited along with a number of other journalists who'd been in Russia during perestroika for a session about how Russia was going to boast of how far it had come since the days of the Soviet Union into perestroika. There were about 7 or 8 journalists who'd been in Russia around that time, a lot of academics who had also been studying Russia. We all came back, we entered Moscow, and we were taken around, and we had interviews with ministers, with leading activists, with dissidents, even then. And we were just about to go back home. We'd been there about a week and a half, 2 weeks, at our hotel in Moscow, when we were all woken up by a phone call about 12 midnight. And they said, we want all of you to come down to the lobby. So we all sort of groggily got dressed, came back down and says, we have one last meeting we want you to go to. They piled us in a bus. At that time, there were about 25 of us. And we drove for about an hour just to the outskirts of Moscow, which is the area where the government dashas are, where all the ministers live, where some of the retired folks live, where Yeltsin lived, where the Andropov had lived, where all the former leaders of the Soviet Union had lived. So elegant dashas from the days of the revolution, before the revolution. We said, what's going on? He says, well, you're going to go visit a very important person in Russia. So we all assumed, well, it's going to be Putin. And it was Putin. So they brought us out to his government dacha. It was now about 2 in the morning. We went through about a phalanx of armed guards, all of them wielding machine guns, and they put us in the anteroom of his dacha, right, just before the bedrooms were and everything else. It was a beautiful house. And we sat there for another hour and a half. Basically, we were in a pool room, around the pool table. Said, what's going on? We're not really going to see President Putin. So we waited. At 3 o'clock in the morning, he walks in. And, he was a very impressive guy, and he still is an impressive guy. But he's a very angry man at that point. And I'm sure that he had always scheduled that he was going to meet with this group from the States. We were from people from Germany, from the UK, from a lot of other places. But he had a message to tell us. So he went around the room, he shook hands with all of us, and he speaks English, but the whole thing was conducted in Russian. And he started talking for a half hour. He launched into a tirade against the West for not supporting Russia in its battle against the Chechen terrorists. He said, none of you came out in the West and really said anything about these terrorists who've taken over this, the school in Beslan. Well, there had been criticism, but the U.S. frankly had seen it as a kind of political event. We were just talking about this, not as a terrorist event. And Putin made the point. He said, look, we had your back in 9/11. We were there. We supported you. We said, we're all going to be in the same war against terrorism. So where are you guys now? This is hypocritical. And he spent a half hour basically yelling at us and through us to, the governments that, we came from. And it only became clear to me afterwards what this was, that this was really the beginning. Not that he probably ever really was a pro-Western figure, but this was his way of saying, that we're tired of being dissed, really, by the West. You just guys don't take us seriously. You really think that we're, now that we're not the Soviet Union, we're not a power anymore, you can do with us what you like. And it was the beginning, I think, of the kind of anger and vindictiveness and one could say myth-making that we're now seeing play out in Ukraine. Because if nothing else, what's going on in Ukraine is Putin's firm conviction that, and he said it many times, that the end of the Soviet Union was a historical disaster for Russia. It ended Russia's position as the third civilization. And his job, his mission in life, is to bring Russia back to the position that it had, I don't know when, the 19th century, early 20th century, 21st century. In his mind, it was going to be Russia overall that was the basic balance to the West, which he continues to say, which he even said as late as yesterday, when he said we're going to keep fighting in Ukraine until the West realizes that they can't kick us around. So I know I've gone over 20 minutes, but I thought that sort of takes it full circle. Russia is an amazing place, an amazing country, an amazing culture and civilization. I have to put aside the barbarism with which it's fighting the war right now. It's the same barbarism with which it fought World War I, World War II, where soldiers were basically cannon fodder. Just threw hundreds of thousands of soldiers into the trenches, and they died until Russia either won or lost. That's how they fight. And they've tried it again. It's the same techniques. But understanding where Russia comes from, their anger, it goes a long way towards figuring out, how we're going to live, because we have to live with Russia, as part of our world. I don't know what the answer is. If I did, I wouldn't be standing here. But it's a long way from 1904, when my father made his way across, and a long way from 2004. And here I am today, PJC. So I'll stop there, and then we can talk about questions.
Well, what is it you think about, is there something about Russian culture or even character that has made it so susceptible to dictatorship and, kind of savagery you describe over the centuries? It's not just the last century.
It's an interesting question, almost impossible to answer. I wouldn't call it savagery. At the turn of the last century, just before Russia went through its revolution, unlike the rest of the world, most governments in Europe, certainly America and Asia, Russia, the Russian Empire, was basically the property of one man, the Tsar. The Tsar was the only person who owned officially property in Russia. If you were a boyar, if you were an aristocrat, if you were a serf, you had the same basic rights as everyone else. You had more money. You could kick people who were less than you, but you basically had no individual property and no individual rights. So it was very easy in a culture like that to pretty much get away with whatever you wanted to get away with. I mean, you could basically, you could do anything with very little responsibility and very little accountability for whatever you did. And that lack of accountability stays with you today. So if you look at, officialdom in Russia today, after perestroika, the U.S. sent armies of lawyers. The American Bar Association came in to try to give Russia a briefing in what courts would be like in a jury trials. Russia didn't have jury trials. Prosecutor and the judge were basically the same thing. It was a way of thinking, a way of approach to life that wasn't savagery, but it was much easier to get things done on the side and underground than it was in the way we might think of doing it. Russians are, more than anything else, are afraid of chaos. When chaos happens, as it happened in the Revolution and the Civil War, lots of people die, and that's still a searing memory for many Russians today whose grandparents, great-grandparents were in the Civil War. So you will find, we found that we wondered what would make Russians mad, what would make them, as journalists, what would be the tinderbox that would set them off? Well, when the coup happened, if you remember in 1991, that was one thing that everybody came together and saw how it was so ridiculous that these guys had kidnapped Gorbachev and claimed that they were going to bring back the Soviet Union. People just couldn't believe it. They didn't revolt necessarily, but they massed in huge numbers all around the country. But it was peaceful. There was violence, but not the kind of violence that you saw in the Civil War. What we always used to say, what we were told, that what would bring Russians out on the streets and what would make them, what would cause another serious bloody civil conflict would be hunger. If you couldn't buy bread, if your ability to feed your family was affected, that's when you'd start to go in the streets. And every Russian regime, from the revolutionary period to now, is very conscious of that. I mean, you notice that the sanctions that we put on after Ukraine hit hard, but people in Russia can still eat. They're not affected by, they can't buy at McDonald's. They can't go to Pizza Hut anymore, which they loved. They loved that, having had that happen to them, but they're still fed. If it ever happened that hunger and starvation really happened in Russia, as happened in Ukraine in the 30s, that's when you'd see a real revolt. That's when you'd see the savagery happen and the kind of, but as of now, just the war in Ukraine, for instance, is not going to bring people out and revolt against the government. So it's not, people prefer to be peaceful if they can with their families. They care about their family more than they care about what happens to society. I mean, there's an intellectual class in Russia which thinks a lot about life and about the future, but the majority of Russians, what they want is safety and security and stability in a way that we can't even conceive of. I mean, closest we can think of being in a situation like that is the Depression, when we went through that. But Russians have been through much worse than the Depression, so that's almost a DNA memory with them. That's the one thing they want to avoid. I don't know if that answers the question, but I wouldn't say. I mean, the savagery that we see on the battlefield, and the cruelty you'll see in the exerted by the police, and the arrests. I mean, that's what you see in police states all over the world. I mean, it's not necessarily identifiable because it's Russia. I mean, it is Russia, so it's pretty bad. But the country is much more than that, I would think.
I'm curious, because obviously Putin and he's the leadership. To what extent, and depending on what the court street is like, well, the country's mostly supports him, kind of supports him, they don't care. I'm trying to think, what distance is there between what Putin's pitching that the Ukrainians are Nazis? Which to the West seems like, oh, you're calling the Ukrainians Nazis? Seems a bizarre thing.
I'm not sure what's the.
So what the question is, where do you see any difference between Putin's vision of the universe and what the Russian people think about the West, the resentment to the West, the allegations that the Ukrainians are Nazis, the West is the one. So, I'm just curious whether
Putin's vision of the universe, Putin's vision of Russia's place in it, is very close to the ordinary Russian's view of Russia, of the place in it. They've grown up with that. They've grown up with Russia being the third Rome, with the Russian Orthodox Church as co-equal with the Catholic Church and less corrupt. They've always seen themselves, goes back to the 19th century, as the pure and incorruptible part of Western civilization. That the West, they are the hybrid of the West and East together. It's such an enormous country. 12 time zones, it stretches from Europe all the way to Asia, and they see themselves as the foundation in many ways of world culture. Russians like to believe that's what they are, and that's what, even whether it's a Russian intellectual or Russian in the street, we'll see that. Now, the intellectual Russians who have a little bit of understanding of the West, aren't that far. I mean, if you scratch them, they will be sort of Russian imperialists. But they also have much more ability to understand where the West is coming from, and an appreciation of the West. But for most Russians, the kind of flirtation they've had with the Western culture, with the McDonald's culture, over the last 15 to 20 years, has not gone well. They're not really impressed by that. So they see the world in much the same way as Putin does. So Putin is not something that's foreign to the Russian point of view. Now, that doesn't mean that people support necessarily the war. There's a huge amount of dissonance in Russia, which we don't see, against the war. It's not like the Vietnam War, where there's a huge movement, but there's a lot of people who just don't agree with and who are ashamed and embarrassed by what's going on. And we see that in the thousands of people who've left Russia. The technological class, the young people who say, I'm not going to be fighting for this war. There's a lot of them. But their point of view, their what makes them tick as Russians is still the feeling that they are something special. And that you can't just imagine that Russia is just some sort of third-class country that, just don't treat us like that. It's one of the mistakes we made, I think, in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Cold War, such as it was, that we thought Russia, the way to cure Russia is make it just like the United States, just like the West, or like the UK. Wrong approach. And, you know, the Russians felt it, and even Russians who were thought like, you know, who went to the West, who went to universities in the West, you know, read Western novels, Western, you know, philosophy, it still was as foreign for them as it was to the Russian in the street.
One thing you said that puzzles me, because you talk about the way Russians fight wars, and basically you're saying that they are used, the
Numbers.
the soldiers are treated like cannon fodder.
Absolutely.
And so I would like to understand that more, because, you know, that would be a reason, because we know like the unofficial numbers of this war, but they're probably close. The reality is that more than 200,000 Russian soldiers.
At least 100,000, but possibly,
At least
yeah.
100,000, that's a lot of people. So you have a lot of dead bodies coming back home, and it's very difficult to hide it.
Well-
And my question is, why isn't this a reason for more people to revolt?
Because Russians, you know, I read something the other day about how a live soldier has almost no currency in Russia. A dead soldier is a hero. So Russians admire martyrs. In Afghanistan, what ended Afghanistan in effect, where Gorbachev pulled Russian troops out of Afghanistan, was the toll. They weren't getting anywhere, and they were bringing lots of body bags home. For some reason, if people believe that what they're fighting for in Ukraine is the strength and the spiritual future of Russia, they can accept that. If you look at Russian TV, even today, I mean, that's what all the debates are. That you know, the way Putin has framed the war is that this was a last chance. We had no choice. We had to go into the Ukraine, because if we didn't, the West would have overwhelmed us. The West would have taken us over, whether it's NATO, whatever else. There's no obvious evidence of that, except if you go back to 2004 after Beslan, you can see where his thinking comes from. And before that, I mean, he's a KGB guy. And they were taught that, you know, the aim of the West was to overcome Russia. This is a, you know, classic, you know, communist indoctrination. So they could accept huge amounts of casualties without, in a way that we couldn't, by thinking that, you know, this is for the good of Mother Russia. It's not demeaning the lives that are spent, because they certainly mourn them. I mean, the ceremonies in the cemeteries all over the country, you just go on, you know, Russian TV or Russian streaming devices, and you see, you know, the huge turnout of people who are mourning these soldiers who died, including prisoners, you know, who were sent first into the front. But they can accept that, at least so far. There might be a point at which they can't. Might be a point at which it becomes so embarrassing, and they can't show any real victory, that things start falling apart. And nobody's asked me about that, but who knows? I mean, that could be the end of it.
Do you think, who knows the answer to this question, but maybe you have a better sense than I certainly would. What if Putin really believes that he's fighting for survival as opposed to for his ego or whatever else is motivating?
Well, my feeling is that what will end this war is Putin being removed from power, either physically, either through a coup or through poisoning or whatever. It's the only thing that will reverse the process now. He can't. There's no way that he can say, I'm going to retreat. The trouble is that we don't know what will replace him. We don't know if who or what will replace him will be even worse. Wagner, but you know, the general staff has been applying a lot of pressure on Putin. We know this. You know, the CIA reports on this, and they're really, really angry at the incompetence that they think Putin is showing, and it's vice versa. A lot of people are angry at what they see the incompetence of the general staff, the military, and the military is basically you know, they advertise themselves since the Cold War ended as totally being as a modernized military force. But we've seen now that they really have not changed substantially in terms of tactics, in terms of approach substantially since World War I. And one giveaway for me on that is that in the early days of the invasion, we were getting reports of soldiers who were wounded on the battlefield in Ukraine, who were left to die there, to be picked up by the Ukrainians. You know, in America, you never leave your colleague, you never leave your comrade on the battlefield. You take him away. Russia's left their guys there, and that's something they've always done. I mean, it just says that there's something basically wrong and rotten in the way the military is operating, and it hasn't changed. It's a totally corrupt organization, unfortunately, and we're seeing the results now. And the chickens have to come home to roost at some point for somebody, because they should not be in such bad shape that the Americans were right in thinking after February 24th that it should be a walkaway. The Russians have the men, they have the equipment. They may not have the strategy, but they could have walked over Ukraine, taken over Kiev in a week. That's what everybody assumed. And the fact that they didn't is a testament to Ukraine. And it's only, remember, the Ukrainian army was also once the Russian army. They all were part of the Russian army, but they've been retrained. And they're fighting for their country. The Russians aren't sure who they're fighting for if they're out there. I can go on and on, but yes.
Two questions. First one is one of NATO strategies has been sanctions. Another strategy has been going after the oligarchs. And is that, I don't fully understand the strategy behind it. What's the, are the oligarchs truly just fronts for Putin? Is Putin's money and assets?
Well, the concept is good, I think, that you want people to pay for supporting Putin, for subsidizing him, basically. But in many ways, things haven't changed since the time of the Tsar. The oligarchs have a lot of money. They're billionaires. They own yachts, everything else. But ultimately, the money and the wealth and the power is all in one man. Putin has control over. He gives and he takes away, and we've seen that in his approach to different oligarchs. He's jailed people like Kolodorsky, who was the richest man in Russia for the longest time. When he started to talk about organizing a political party, he lost his power, and Putin put him in jail. So it is important to go after those guys, to make them hurt for their support of the war. And it does make sense in a certain way to go after the oligarchs. And the sanctions have in general, have certainly, as far as I can tell, have had an effect. They haven't had the effect that we wanted necessarily them to have, and they probably couldn't, because Russia is a big country, big economy. And there's a lot of countries in the world, major countries, not just China, but India and Africa, who rely on Russian oil and Russian trade, and that can keep Russia going for a while. But that said, sanctions were a reasonable strategy, and we're applying more. The Europeans are thinking of applying bans on Russian diesel fuel now. So it's a slow process, and the Russian economy is half of what it was 2 years ago. There's no doubt about it. People just can't get what they used to get in the streets, but they're not starving. And as I said, if it does come to the point where they can't feed themselves, then that's where this problem is. But I don't think we'll ever get to that point where our sanctions will force them to that point.
My second question is, do you think that Putin is insane enough to use a nuclear war?
I'm not, I thought he was stupid to begin with to go into Ukraine. It made no sense strategically. No sense as a foreign policy move. Maybe it made sense to threaten it, but it made no sense to actually figure he was going to invade Ukraine, because what would he come out of it with? There was nobody in Ukraine that would have, been part of a government that would have listened to Moscow. In the same way, it's easy to threaten nuclear weapons, but to use them would be so destructive for Russia. Russia would be, it would mean the collapse of the state, basically. I mean, how the West would respond, I don't know. Russia can use tactical nuclear weapons, certainly, and it would be the first use of them anywhere in the world, but he could use them and have limited damage. But I think once you open that Pandora's box, there's no way of closing it. And I don't think that even Putin, or certainly his advisors, are crazy enough or stupid enough to do that, even if they're pushed up against the wall. Now, I can be proved wrong. But my feeling is, the more I look at it, and the more when he first talked about it and threatened it, he did it again. He threatened it again yesterday. I don't know if you saw it, but everybody took him seriously. But I just can't. It boggles the mind. I don't think it could happen.
Why do you say it would be the collapse of the state, given everything you said about, the whole idea of Russia?
Well, because for the moment, Russia would be like burning its own house down. The first country to use a nuclear weapon.
No, but there's one thing you said that the only way this is gonna end is Putin is removed of if he's killed. Wouldn't he be radical to the point of saying, if I'm going down, yeah,
Well, I mean,
everything's going down.
Hitler might have done that. Putin is not Hitler. I think there are enough people around Putin who would say no. If that happens, you're out. And we can see precedent for that in previous eras of the Soviet system, where people were, the Russians they're not stupid. They may be crazy, but they're not suicidal. And I think, there are very few people. There may be some right-wing Russians who say, "Yeah, let's nuke the Ukrainians." But generally speaking, I think the Russian opinion, majority opinion, such as it is, would not be in favor of it. That's my guess. I could be wrong, but it just doesn't compute for me that he would actually go through with it. He can threaten it. There are things that he could do, maybe just go right up to the point where it looks like he's about to use nuclear weapons. But I think, Washington and London have made clear in no uncertain terms, not to mention Beijing, that what would happen if he did actually use them. He would be, and that counts. Certainly what Beijing thinks and what India thinks count. And India has also been against it. So, as I say, Putin may be crazy, but he's not suicidal.
Did Ukraine at one point, didn't they have nuclear weapons of their own?
Yes, they gave it up.
So did the West make a mistake in the way they approached all this? Because my recollection, tell me if I'm wrong, is that they gave it up in return for an understanding that they'd be allowed to join NATO. But then
Not to join NATO, but they gave it up in terms in the agreement with Russia that Russia would respect the treaty.
Okay.
It would not
So maybe
affect.
Ukraine didn't deal with it, right? But-
Right, and people are saying, well, you should never have done that, but I think if they had nuclear weapons today, would Russia still invade? Probably.
But then corollary to that, did the West make a mistake in not embracing Ukraine sooner, bringing them into NATO as Ukraine wanted to do for years, saying we don't want to provoke Putin, and maybe with somebody like Putin, it shouldn't be don't provoke him, but stand up to it?
When I was still there, I remember covering President Bush, first President Bush, who went to Kiev, and Gorbachev asked Bush to do whatever he could to tamp down nationalism at that point in Ukraine. Because Ukrainians were talking about, at that point, independence, like all the other Soviet republics. So Bush gave what people then called his Chicken Kiev speech. And he said, nationalism is bad, it's not going to get you anywhere. It's important to stay together as a country, as a Soviet Union. Don't do it. So everything that we did, we were not pro-nationalists. We did not want the Soviet Union to break up the way it did. The idea of NATO expansion, which came in the Clinton era, I frankly think was a mistake. I think the idea that to buy all the Eastern Europeans to join NATO was obviously calculated to get Russia really mad and angry, and there was no point, there was no need for it, because we could have protected them, defended them, whether they were in NATO or not. Now, that argument is over. Now Ukraine will end up joining NATO for sure. But I don't think joining NATO at the time, least of all Ukraine, but Estonia and all the other Soviet republics, not to mention Poland and all the rest of them. I mean, I think that would not have prevented what we're seeing now. The Russians would still have seen any Western alliance right up against their borders as a threat, then or now. And I don't think, I think we could have handled it better. I think that was a mistake, a foreign policy mistake on the part of Clinton's part. I still believe that. A lot of people do think so. But that's water under the bridge.
Maybe one or two more, maybe? One or two more?
Yeah.
I mean, people would say as late as they want.
Yeah, Marjorie?
I just have a quick one, is that, I'll corollary after what you just said. Finland and Sweden took the quick opportunity to
Join.
get NATO alliance now when Russia.
Turkey doesn't want that, yeah.
Except for Turkey trying to block it, but I think it's sort of de facto, I think. Do you think that Finland is in danger?
No, I think it's inevitable now. I mean, I don't know what NATO means now. I mean, for the first time, NATO actually means something. But it's actually, it's a statement to the Russians to say, look, you went in this to weaken NATO, instead you strengthened it. So at some point, Putin, whoever replaces him, is going to have to turn around to the Russians and say, hey, we've got now a stronger alliance of the West against us than we had before. And they can't reverse that. So it's definitely going to, Sweden and Finland, God, to have them join NATO, that's revolutionary.
So you said a little bit about it, but there was at least one New York Times opinion article about oligarchs making response to incompetence being the more likely near-term reason that Putin might go down. Because not having food seems less likely than powerful people within Russia. So what would it take for that to happen if it might, and then what would fill the vacuum if Putin went away?
Well, there's a lot of questions in there. Let me take the oligarch question. I don't know how to answer, because again, going back to my time in Russia and in the Russia post-Soviet Union, I met a lot of oligarchs. Talked with a lot of them, and they were very interesting people. A lot of them were Jewish, which they, which was held against them in subsequent years. And these guys had all been, they've been entrepreneurs, they've been young communists, and they made their money usually illegally. But everyone made money illegally at that point. Everyone was in league with the mafia, with the underground, with the cartels. So, and some of them were smart enough to get their money out. But they all thought somehow that, they could stay around. They basically had no sense of responsibility for the country at all. It was all, I'm making money for myself and my family. I don't care what happens to the rest of it, because I don't know how long this is going to last, which is a sort of a reprise of how it was back in the 1920s and 30s. So, the era of the oligarchs, it's probably past now, because I don't know where they're going to get their money from. Their money is all held up and frozen in banks. There's a few oligarchs who are sort of pro-Ukrainian and have kept their money and they're using it, but not that many. And there, of course, are Ukrainian oligarchs too. I mean, they were. There's no lack of corruption in Ukraine, which Zelensky is now finding out. So the fact of oligarchical power in Russia is one of the problems of governance in Russia. I mean, we have a problem here where the 1% of wealth is held by 1% of the people hold what 18%, 20% of the wealth. And that's bad. That's inequity. In Russia, it's worse because not only may have no power, but the money that you do have is not used for anything good in terms of the country. You can't govern it. You can't regulate it. It's basically a money flow that goes out of the country, in the country. It basically corrupts the entire country. As far as Putin, vacuums of power are filled very quickly in Russia. So there are lots of people who are potentially able to take over. None of them are good from our points of view at this point. I mean, the guy who is most aligned with our democratic values is in prison right now, Navalny, and there's almost no support anywhere else. So I don't know what will happen. If Putin leaves, there will probably be a military person who will take over for him. Or alternatively, Medvedev, who's the prime minister, who was a Democrat at one point, and Putin basically took all his power away. But now Medvedev is kind of closer to Putin's line, and he's probably playing this sort of like DeSantis is playing Trump, right? He's almost out Putin-y Putin, and he's a civilian, so he's a possibility. He's one of the people, but otherwise it's impossible to know.
Can I just ask, maybe this is the note to end on if everyone's as tired as he is. Can I just ask about the Jews? Is Russia a place for a Jew right now?
I was going to talk a little bit more about that because one of the most moving days of my stay in Russia when I was there as a correspondent was Yom Kippur in 1990, when you could actually celebrate Yom Kippur in the Central Synagogue in Moscow. They opened it up. Jews had always been there, and I went there with a bunch of people. It was crowded, and there was still the KGB standing in front, right, making sure they weren't taking names, but you knew they were there. But it was the first time you could actually go openly to a synagogue, and Russians can go there too. So for Jews, life was a lot better. There's still anti-Semitism. It was a lot better after Perestroika. Putin has some really, really good alliances and connections with the Chabad movement. And they supported him, and still do support him. I don't see any particular sign right now. I don't see any, or I haven't seen it, I could be wrong, of any anti-Semitism, or more so than the usual in Russia, that's come out as a result of the war or since Putin has been in power. So, Russia has not been a friendly place for Jews, but there are lots of Jews who are in power and who are running businesses and stuff like that, so they are operating there safely. So I haven't seen any evidence of overt anti-Semitic acts. Thank you. Is it good?
I thought so. I was fascinated. This is really my use idea. I was really fascinated. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, it was good.
So inspiring, really, thank you.
Thank you.
Amazing.
A lot of fun. after this. I wouldn't, I can't visit. I can't visit that.
If I tell you that Barrow Laser was just radically bringing refugees when did you first get there?
I got there first,
The big synagogue.
I couldn't do that. But I started living there.
What publication are you?
I wrote for a Canadian newspaper called the Charles Star,
Okay.
and the British magazine called
I'll take you what Wednesday. I'll take you.
Then after that, I worked for Time Magazine.
Gabriel, I'll take you right now.
First also was, writing.
I do too. Me, it's not an act.
This is probably a stupid question, but,
You're not tired?
There are islands of democracy around us. It's a huge country. And I always found that you go to cities around Russia, in the Urals, the East Europe, the Pacific area, the Caucasus. You find people who actually run things, humanitarian and democracy.
It is.
I don't think Canada and Russia have been treated something else. Democratic policy. It's just not part of their DNA.
And you got a guy when I was 10.
Communism. I mean, exactly.
I found that this is a shift in my grandfather's name on Israel. His immigration records, and I found like 1933, Hertz Resnick, you know, where he entered, I believe, he entered Haifa, 1933. Yeah, I was out there. Yeah.
You're so far away from understanding democracy. They want bread. That's all they know. No power, no rights. Exception of rights. It's not part of the match. It's just, it had to be a learned experience. There was no historical background. No vision.
Oh, wow. My grandfather. My grandfather.
Yes, of course.
Товарищ, пошли, ребята, пошли!
You see me in the time correspondence.
And he
In the generation
whole life he
before,
was on.
I was there.
Okay.
And then
And then, of course, I knew it well.
in 1947,
Yeah.
he was afraid to
great.
fight,
Yeah.
when he came to America.
All right,
And
very
he,
good.
and
That
he
was
felt
great, thank you so much.
he carried this shit. This is your
What do you think? They would?
Well, obviously, we have different his whole life, and it's all he cared. I never got to explore this with him.
Yeah. I don't know if it's higher or lower.
He really, this was his entire, he defined his whole life. It's tragic. can understand it, but think about it,
Go
it's
anywhere.
very, very sad.
But the reason, yeah, it was incredible, we never would have, that's why I went to Russia. That's why all the correspondents of my generation set up bureaus in Russia, because for the first time, you could pretty much go and talk to them without.
You know what I said? Your opinion.
Yeah,
Now, they get cold in this.
we should talk about, yeah, the Russians. Oh, yeah. But we could go anywhere, we could, I mean, there's KGB are all over, so. But at least we can travel. I could go.
Normally, you have to apply, saying that I want to go to Chisinau, and I'm going to take a plane at 7 o'clock, whatever.
That's right.
That would be
And you
historic.
have to check in and they would watch you. and all that.
Right, and you would have to have permission to do it, which you could be granted or not.
Yeah, I can tell more stories about how KGB still went over everything we did, but it was a lot better than it was 10 years before. Correspondents couldn't go anywhere. Every time they went someplace, the KGB was stopping.
Well, understanding, part of Moscow was really closed.
Oh, yeah.
So even though certain districts of Moscow were open for foreign visitors. And they immediately tell, even if you walk, they are looking at your clothes and see who you are.
It wasn't that much different. They would watch.
So for us, it's not flying rockets, it's like normal stuff, yeah?
People were afraid to go with
Yeah,
you.
when they
My
go
You
to
know
war,
exactly, yeah, like for these people, you know, this is like, everybody,
the good thing that when KGB listened to our conversation, they didn't care about business and women. And these were two things that were.
She actually signed a papers on it.
When my mom had
And
her,
they
what
didn't care
was
about
the,
that. They would
your
allow some to
friend's
do some
daughter
business,
from
they
Czech
would allow
Republic
to see several
was
women.
famous
they
for
didn't
a few
care
weeks in
for that.
St. Petersburg.
Moreover, I thought it
Went
was
to
good,
visit my
if
aunt
these guys
in
busy with
Moscow,
women,
she
he's
wouldn't
not
agree
busy with state.
that your
Yeah,
she
it's
had
from
to stay with
their
some
perspective.
Oh, my.
friend's house because
What year was that?
oh, it's crazy.
I
So-
think it was
We were eating
70s.
with that, had nothing to do.
Dark
Late
ages,
70s.
dark ages for sure.
Only now, why we go so far? I'm not understanding this shit.
Why,
It's
what?
like, okay, the Ukraine give the weapon and in 2004, and the United States, the United States say, okay, we take care of you, you know? We shake their hands, fucking, you know, give the weapons, yeah? And in 2000, you know.
Who, us?
Yeah, the US.
So now, what
the US
happened is like,
security.
what do you think, if the Putin go, if the Trump will be still sit down?
Oh.
Hey, give me an answer, what do you think?
Oh,
How this
But
is?
they were best friends, so it wouldn't be
It's
an
not,
issue.
this is the.
I don't know.
I think we'll be still on a hold, yeah?
I think so. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I've been thinking about it.
Trump
a lot.
believes that when
I
he
think
was
we
in
are-
power, Putin did nothing.
But Putin did nothing because Putin did
He
nothing.
thought
Zelensky,
Putin was scared of him.
Zelensky,
he was not.
No, he wasn't.
It's the opposite.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's quite
Putin
clear
might have
that
Trump
Trump,
is scared.
look at that
we
whole thing
know about
in
the Zelensky,
Helsinki.
people start talking
He's
bullshit.
managed
I think we'll be fucking grounded.
Yeah.
Trump is
You know,
managed.
the thing that Trump could never have done, which is what Biden did, was bring the alliance together. So even if Trump seriously was going to fight against
But he,
Putin,
why would he?
nobody else would fight with him. I mean, the Germans hated him, the British hated him, so nobody would stand because.
But also, he
Trump
loves
had put
Putin.
down-
He's a big, beautiful man.
Right, but even
He
beyond
had
that,
business, he had business.
Oh, business.
but nobody took.
Well, that's what I mean, he has business with Russia, and he
Right,
wants
he
business
has-
after now.
He has hotel
And
there,
they're
so-
Jared and
Yeah, and the
Ivanka.
girls
Oh,
and
because
everything.
in that take him serious, say, fuck, maybe it's fucking, he do it
He's
something.
crazy
So
too,
both
yeah.
will be playing the same cards.
Oh, the
I
crazy
think we'll
card.
be on the hold, and
I think
maybe we get a Sleepy Joe again, and we'll be fucked.
Who knows?
Really,
I don't know.
you know?
I don't know. Because there's still
I don't
other,
You think
at
so?
the end though,
So
it
why the
doesn't, but
Germans
it's,
still
at
buy
the end
the
it
gas?
doesn't.
Where is like Putin still getting the money? Every day, you know,
Russia.
he get
From
so
Germany.
much money
From the oil.
from Ukraine people who put the sanction on him. Still they buy. The only thing he not go directly, he go to the wherever, to the China or go to
Yeah.
the India and come back to the German.
Yeah,
The fucking BS.
but it's a lot less than he would have otherwise.
Of course, you cut the string,
But
little by
still.
little.
So you can never.
Still, he says like you got it enough for the 10 years to fight the war.
But
With the
but
whatever
he's
the
talking
people
about
support.
100, I mean, with this Archbishop Kirill, I mean, there's, they had the 100-year war with Sweden on top of Poland, right? 100 years, and it's no big deal, it's 100 years, it's not I don't care, it's not my children,
Yeah,
he
exactly.
doesn't have kids in this thing.
He only
In Russia?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, not 98 anymore. 98%, not anymore.
What we say at the beginning of the war, we
Well,
say
those who
80
don't
something,
support the
89,
regime.
or